So again, thank you all so much for joining us today. I was saying earlier before we hit record that this is clearly a hot topic for our current families, for families in the community. Out of all of our community collaboration series for this school year, it had by far the most registrants. So clearly a hot topic, something that parents, our caregivers are searching for information on. So with that being said, thank you so much for being here. We have the Effective Students organization here to share some more on executive function, kind of an overview of that. So I will pass it along to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carrie. It's my pleasure. Hey, guys. My name is Rachel Barron, and I hope today in our time together, I'm able to impart some useful information so that you can use that either in with your own children or your classroom, or even just to help you feel a little bit of relief so that there's a name for what you may be feeling or experiencing as your kids grow up. And what I'll probably do is go ahead and just start by introducing myself. Like, why were you here? Why do you want to listen to me? So, really, why do we talk about executive function? So, what I've noticed over time in the education space and the more research that I've done is that executive functions are the leading indicator of long term success. Okay, well, that seems to be a heavy lift, especially if your kid struggling with reading or with math. But fewer and fewer students we're seeing who are neurodiverse, who have learning differences, are entering post-secondary education. Okay, so that really can be a concern, and kids can get turned off of schools. And we don't want that to happen because learning is part of our whole life and their current responsibilities. But also, we observe that bright students often are not thriving. And so I went to hear a presentation when my kids were younger about executive function skills. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is exactly why my kids are not thriving. So fast forward, why would a parent get into this? So I was an educational advocate for 6.5 years. And what I noticed is that more and more students were not able to begin tasks, complete tasks, walk out of the room with their materials, return and turn their materials in. And it was really hindering their success in the classroom. Personally, I have three boys who are now 26, 22, and 20. They all have a form of ADHD and or a learning difference. So not only was I experiencing this professionally, I was living it personally at home, trying to get homework done and dealing with all these fun things associated with EF, including working memory and task initiation, those types of things. Today, what do we do at Effective Students? So we have an academic coaching practice in person, both in Charlotte and in Atlanta, and we see kids virtually all around the country. We also partner with schools to provide training and evidence-based curricula around executive function skills, but the majority of the work we do is directly with families. So, really, what are executive functions, right? So, we hear this buzzword, schools talk about it, but let's go ahead and come back to the definition of what are executive functions. So, it's a set of processes that have to do with managing yourself and your resources to achieve a goal. But it's an umbrella term for neurologically based skills involving mental control and self regulation. Wonderful, right? It's a wonderfully clear definition. So if I said to a parent, hey, you need to work on your kids' executive function skills, how would we do that? Right? It seems to be overwhelming. So in the DSM 5 TR, which is the current edition, executive functions are not recognized as a standalone condition, but it's rather a symptom of other conditions. And is this as executive function skills or ADHD? We often see that. Oftentimes, the lack of executive function skills is a natural symptom of kids who also struggle with ADHD, but not always. Um, so, just to understand, this is sort of the common definition and where it most often occurs. It can often occur in students who have no LD. It can occur in students who have other learning differences like language based learning differences, but don't also have a diagnosis of ADHD. So here we have this wonderful definition. which isn't, it's informing us, but it's not really giving us some handles on how to handle it. So we like to simplify things at Effective Students, and we view executive functions as the ability to evaluate resources, formulate a plan, and implement them. Sounds simple, right? Now think about your plan to get your kids out the door in the morning for school, or think about the plan when you sit down and say, well, where's that study guide so you can study for the quiz tomorrow? So normally very well-meaning students can do 2 out of 3 of these things and they stumble or they struggle or they fail. And so in order to have a good ability to follow through, you've got to have a solid evaluating resources and making a plan. So I like to use the grocery store example. How many of you guys go to the grocery store? You can raise your hands, right? But I personally detest the grocery store. I don't like to go. Um, it's a thing for me. But given if I have 3 boys and my boys come home for Thanksgiving and I don't have any food in the house because I didn't go to the grocery store, what do we call those boys? Hangry. We call them hangry. So I know I have to do something I don't want to do to experience an improved result. I have to go to the grocery store and get food so my kids don't order Uber Eats or they don't spend money on my credit card, et cetera, et cetera. So I say, okay, great. I'm going to go to the grocery store. Now, if I go to the grocery store with a list, what happens? That's right. I check it off. I move through the aisles. It's very straightforward. I am in and I am out. And I get home, hopefully with the sugar or the chocolate chips in order to actually make my cookies, right? But what happens if I go to the grocery store without a list? I'm wandering around. I might be thinking about another recipe. I might forget something for an additional recipe. And even though I might have my phone, it's still only helping me stay on track a little bit. So I explain this to kids because a lot of times kids are tired of being told what to do. A lot of times parents are tired of telling them what to do. And so one of the things we like to focus on is teaching kids how to make their own lists. Leaders make their own lists, right? So that's a component of that. Now, many of you have probably talked about that in relation to a planner, write it in your planner. There's a whole conversation we can have about that too. But generally speaking, leaders make their own lists, and we've got to be able to help kids evaluate resources, make a plan, and follow through. Okay? All right, let's keep going. So here's a diagram of executive functions, right? So they're between 9 and 12 different skills that develop over the course of adolescence. Okay? And we think about teachers and kids while they're developing these skills are going to school, and they're also trying to learn reading, math, science content, and all of these things at the same time. So how many of you find this diagram to be overwhelming? Just raise your hand or put your hand up in the screen. Okay, good. It was intended to be overwhelming, actually, because my preferred way of looking at the very same information is by giving you the umbrella. So the interesting thing is in both diagrams, there's the identical amount of information, but it's how we present this information that makes it either easier or difficult for students to understand. Okay. So years ago, when I began teaching executive function skills, I would run into other people who said they do the same. And I would say, oh, that's great. What do you work on? And they say emotional control. And I thought to myself, well, I don't teach emotional control. I'm teaching how do you organize your materials? How do you manage your time and plan ahead? And so what I found is in these 12 different skills, there was really no category of what to work on at a given time. So at Effective Students, we view these as 2 distinct categories of executive function skills. One falls under what we call academic management, and the other involves social emotional skills. Now, we've seen an incredible rise in students who struggle with anxiety today. And if you haven't heard about it, I'm sure there's the book called The Anxious Generation. It's out, has a lot to do with how our kids are feeling. We at Effective Students don't discount that at all, but we also find that sometimes we can relieve some of the anxiety students are feeling by teaching the academic management skills they need to meet their responsibilities successfully. So when we talk about this organization, where is my stuff? Time management, when is my stuff due? Planning and prioritizing, what should I begin first? Sustained attention, what happens if your mind wanders? Not does it wander, but what happens when it does wander? How do we bring it back? Working memory, go upstairs, brush your teeth, wash your face, and get ready for bed. How many of your kids go upstairs, see their sibling, walk down the hallway, and give a little push? That's what happened in my house all the time. It's the ability to hold multiple pieces of information and do something with it at the same time. So kids with ADHD often struggle with executive functions, and they also struggle with working memory. And then task initiation is, how do you get started on tasks? So just a few tips here. We generally say if your student struggles with working memory and you have to give them a list of things to do, give them a sticky note. Go upstairs and look at the note. If we have a task initiation issue, we typically say do the easiest thing first. Often students will be told to do the most difficult thing first, but behavioral science tells us that if we are able to succeed in small things, we're more inclined to do another thing, right? So always begin with the easier thing first. Okay, so academic management is one of our curriculum that we work on. It's our oldest curriculum in effective students, and we think these skills often make the social emotional skills a little bit easier. But if the blue side is under construction, the orange side is also under construction. So as kids are growing up, when we were back in the day, right? We always say back in the day when I was growing up, this was really called adolescence, right? These are skills that naturally develop or should naturally develop throughout adolescence, but are not doing so necessarily for a number of different reasons we don't need to get into, but it's more of a focus today about how it impacts kids socially and how it impacts kids academically. So I like to explain emotional control as remaining chill when things are not chill. Now, many of you may not have teenagers, but at some point you might. Um, Handling the emotional regulation in your home, both in yourself and your kids, can be hard. A friend of mine used to say when your kids are born, they were automatically given your button they could push at any given time, right? Emotional control. And they have to be able to take that into the school system or into their school and have some degree of emotional control in dealing with peers, in dealing with frustration, in dealing with setbacks. Flexible thinking, finding more than one way to solve a problem, or even being able to adjust to unmet expectations, right? What if you had a play date but it canceled? What if you had a soccer game and it rained? Or maybe you didn't win, or maybe you're having difficulty solving a math problem. How do we come around that? That directly relates to what we call goal directed persistence, the ability to set a goal and stick with it in the face of setbacks and distractions. Metacognition, you may have heard of the word mindfulness. Anybody hear of the word mindfulness? It's a lot about being aware of where we are today and what is your brain doing. But in summary, metacognition is thinking about your thinking. What was my brain doing? Did I really understand that? How was I acting in that situation? Response inhibition, I think that goes without saying, is impulse control. Uh, Shorthand for that in our family was squirrels. I don't know if anybody else has squirrels, but it's like squirrel, right? You could have a whole bunch of boys in a room and there'd be squirrels everywhere. And then stress tolerance. How do we respond to stressful situations? Humans have three natural responses: fight, flight, or fawn, right? Fight, flight, or fawn. Well, those exist in grown-ups, but they also exist in kids. So at some point, they may have to experience stress at school, and we want to know how are they responding to that stress or something that's difficult for them. Helpful diagram? Good. All right. So we feel that the blue side is really a bridge to be able to reach kids on the orange side. Okay. All right. So let's put our kid hat on and let's pretend we're back in middle school or sixth grade, right? And off we go. And what is our job when we go to school, right? Well, we have to learn new content every single day. Let's just pause on that for a minute. How many of you in your current jobs, whether you're staying at home or you're working professionally, that you have to learn something new every single day? That's tiring, right? That creates something in their brain called cognitive load, right? Which is just how much can that brain take in on a given day before it needs a break and it can reintegrate what it's learned. Okay, so just that alone is a lot. We expect students to be able to track their assignments, not only in hard copy, but digital, right? Which is one form of abstract, and sometimes across multiple platforms, not just Google Classroom, not just Canvas, or Schoology, all these things. They have to deal with the matriculation from one grade to the next. Maybe there will be a change in expectations amongst teachers, shifting between classes if your kids are rotating, making grades and performing well on standardized tests as they get older does compete for their attention, emotional development, and just being a teenager, as well as social activities. So I think back on my childhood, and I think I was allowed to do brownies in a year and then one sport. And I know that today's kids have a lot more on their plate, right? So kids are moving and changing from one activity to another. So it's exhausting if we think about what it's like just to be a student again. So it's important to also remember that executive functions are skills, right? Skills are developed, they're not innate. Just as reading is a skill, math is a skill, packing your materials to get out the door is a skill, right? This isn't an innate thing, which means that each student can have strengths and weaknesses just like all of us, right? Some people are adept typers and can touch type without an issue. Some people do much better when they write. So we have to recognize, even if we have multiple children, even if we teach, every student is going to present differently. They can have great orange side skills, but struggle with some discrete limitations on the blue side. So just be aware of that. The process of developing skills takes time and practice, but it can be taught. So, how many of you have picked up a new skill lately, a new hobby, a tennis racket? How many practice pickleball, right? It's now the most popular sport, pickleball, right? Maybe somebody picked up knitting. Maybe somebody decided they wanted to play mahjong. I have friends who now play mahjong, okay? New. When you learn something new, is it easy or hard? It's hard. That's right. And the more you practice it, what happens? It gets easier. So we think about that in the context of our kids learning to pack their bags or walk out of the house on time or tidy their rooms. It takes practice, but it can be taught. And that we as parents and educators are an integral part of making that happen and giving them the real opportunities to practice and not taking that from them. And the one way that happens is by giving them that space, but setting those expectations and that are realistic and clear. So oftentimes I was giving a presentation the other day about communicating with your kids, and I sat back and thought, am I being clear? Right? Am I being clear about the expectation that I want them to meet? Okay, good. So with every skill, right, we have to start somewhere, and skills are developed and they're not innate. So many of you may know of Malcolm Gladwell and his book Outliers. And his theory is that in order to develop a skill, you have to have 10,000 hours worth of practice. Now, maybe that holds true today and maybe it doesn't. There's some theories that if you learn through play, you don't need that many hours. But let's just say, for our purposes, a habit is something that you can do 3,000 times and you have a habit, but a skill is something you have to do 10,000 times to be able to do it under pressure. Okay? So just think for a second, what brings pressure for students at school? Tests, quizzes, peers, grade expectations, social skills, all of these things can bring pressure for students. So if we give them the opportunity to practice and we help them realize that doing hard things builds competency and capacity within themselves, they're much more encouraged to continue. Okay. So acknowledging that and praising them for moving up in their habits is important. So here's a question. How many opportunities are there in a given school year to develop the habit of planning ahead? Okay. So let's say there are 180 days of school and there are 5 academic classes. Is anyone courageous enough to drop in the chat how many opportunities a student has to write in his or her planner in a given school year?
A lot.
A lot.
I'm bad at
That's a
math,
great,
but a lot.
a lot. Okay. So if we do 180 times 5, it is 900. So a student has 900 opportunities to write in his or her planner in a given school year. How many years would it take just to build the habit of that personal accountability, that external accountability of getting work done? 3 plus, 3 plus, right? So think about this as good reps and not taking that away as a learning opportunity, but also having some empathy for kids as they develop these skills. Okay, so this is how learning happens. We practice, we get some feedback, or we get some awareness of what's working and what's not working. We have to make those changes, right? That happens to us as adults. It happens to us with pickleball. It happens to kids with learning and social skills. So, feedback. When a kid struggles with ADHD, they have a tendency to get more negative feedback than other students do. And there's some research about that. So we want to be careful when we bring that feedback to students so that feedback can be positive or just reinforce the fact that maybe they're becoming aware that they forgot something or how they're going to cure that prospectively, right? So, how can we give them that feedback, even if it might be pushing our buttons in a positive way so they can learn how to make those changes? And this is the learning cycle. We can't talk about executive functions without talking about goals, grit, and a growth mindset, right? There's nothing wrong with a little alliteration, right? What are your kids' goals, right? What are your goals in this situation? Well, the kid's goal might be just to get the homework finished and out the door so he or she can go play with their friends, right? But maybe the goal is also to learn the material in the shortest amount of time so you have to study less when it comes to the day before the test. Talking about their students' goals helps them to set goals and begin to align their responsibilities with their own personal goals. Grit. How many of you guys have watched Angela Duckworth's TED Talk about grit, right? Everybody's talking about grit, the ability to persevere when things are difficult. So often we reward our kids and praise our kids for doing things well, but truly, a long term indicator of success is their ability to persevere. So I'll be honest, I have a girl crush on Sarah Blakely. Everybody know who Sarah Blakely is? She's definitely, if you've worn a set of Spanx, you know how Sarah Blakely is, right? So there's a story about how she came home every day and her father said to her, "Where did you fail today?" And at first I thought, oh, what a terrible thing to say to your child. Where did you fail today? But he followed it up by saying, and what did you learn from that? Right? Pick yourself back up and go back at it. I think often we're so worried about our kids performing well and being the top of this or competing that we underestimate the value of perseverance as leading them to real success. Nothing worthwhile in life ever came easy. Has anybody ever heard that? If you're in my generation, right? Nothing worthwhile ever came easy. I think so often in our instant in environment in our culture today, we're not helping our kids or recognizing the value of a struggle isn't necessarily a bad thing. And you can't talk about grit without also talking about a growth mindset, right? A growth mindset is I can't do it yet, or I haven't learned how yet, or I haven't succeeded yet. So I don't know how many of you guys are baseball fans. I'm a huge baseball addict. I'm just going to confess that. And I did watch the College World Series last year. I watch it every year. And one of the teams follows Jocko Willink, who, as you guys know, is Navy SEAL from SEAL Team 6, one of the leaders. And every time something bad happens, the team would yell, good, which seems really counterintuitive, right? Why would we yell good if you didn't get something or you something didn't go the way you wanted? It's because that is now in front of us. We see it and we can move it to the side. Good, you can learn from that. Okay, what did you learn from that situation? You had an argument with your friend, he took your pencil. Good. How are you going to resolve that? How can you handle that situation? So just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean we don't have the opportunity to learn that. And if we can teach kids this at an early age, they're going to have a much better trajectory and ability to bounce back as they get older. Okay, so what is our job as parents, right? All of this is helpful. It's sort of a good idea, but what is my job as a parent? Should I do this for my kids? Should I not do this for my kids? Okay, so our role as parents is to support them without necessarily solving the problem, right? So when you talk about teenagers or even younger kids, I remember saying, let the consequence do its job. Maybe forgetting an assignment at school. I have one teacher who is also a client. Her son actually went to school without shoes one day, right? Letting the consequence do its job is important. So our role is to come alongside, but not necessarily solve the problem for the student. Creating awareness versus telling. I grew up in the day of Charlie Brown. What did the Charlie Brown teacher sound like? Wah, 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 right? They can turn it off. They're not going to listen, right? But creating awareness is a lot more helpful than telling students, go do this, go do that. What do you think you should do first? How do you want to handle that? What do you want to do next? Make a plan and they'll talk about it. Remaining emotionally neutral versus escalating. This is probably one of the hardest things for me, particularly when my kids were little, is how do I remain emotionally neutral when they've done something that's upsetting to me or is frustrating or is just one other thing that might need to land on my plate versus them having to do it, right? And us having to step in. Remaining emotionally neutral, stepping away and saying, whew, I need a minute is going to model that. Um, Usually yelling doesn't work. I learned that by experience. My funny story is my kid would go 40 feet up a magnolia tree to avoid his homework, and he would say, you can't get me. And he was exactly right. I could not get him all the way up there. So, how can we be a thermostat versus a thermometer, right? Be a thermostat, remain calm, set the temperature, set the expectations, put your oxygen mask on first, right? How can we return and give some encouragement versus criticism, right? Our kids are little, they're still learning, right? Learning should be a lifelong thing. Failure is not a bad thing, it's information about what worked and what didn't. So, giving kids encouragement helps them to develop that growth mindset and get back up and try again. As your kid gets older, offering resources versus requiring resources. So, you're going to have a tutor because your math grade is X. So we see that happen a lot, right? And then kids come to us, and the student either goes to the tutor, doesn't bother learning in class, and just decides to learn the information from the tutor versus teaching themselves. But then they end up saying, well, I don't really want to go to the tutor. I don't need the tutor because they don't want to commit the time to do it, right? I'm willing to offer you a resource to make this for you to get better at this, but here's what I expect of you, right? Is to make good use of that resource, right? Sometimes we get over involved as parents as solving the problem versus creating the constraint and enabling them to make choices about how to solve the problem, right? Let's give an example of a student we had the other day. Um, he was getting driven. We were trying to schedule an appointment, albeit virtually, and he was being driven to a workout series. And I just gotten the updated amount of missing work from the middle school principal. And then I was able to say to the parent, why is he going to the workout? Why are you driving him there? He needs to clean this up before he's allowed to go. That's letting the consequence do its job. That's allowing him to become somewhat uncomfortable to deal with his responsibilities. And then leading by example, kids do so much more watching us than what we tell them to do. They are always, always watching us. So, how we lead ourselves, how we follow through with our responsibilities, how we prioritize speaks volumes, and as well as how we communicate. So, back into executive function skills. All right. So, we're really talking about these skills as an overlay, right? So it's not going to replace math, English, or science, but these are the skills that are going to make all of these academics easier to learn, right? So this is the overlay portion of it. So, what should we expect from students at any given age? So, we've come up with this outline as what we would generally expect from primary school, lower school, middle school, and upper school students by age and stage, right? Organization and space, as well as time management. When to introduce a family calendar, when to help them identify themselves on a family calendar. So, it's a little alarming if you think about how much time it takes for them to learn to identify themselves on a family calendar or align their time and tasks. And I remember when I said to my husband, I'm going to teach all of our kids how to use a digital calendar and I'll be able to see all of their appointments. And my husband said, that will never work, which is not usually a good thing to say to me. And I, of course, responded with, hold my beer. Like, let's go. We're going to figure it out. So I had to start with going to Walmart and I got a huge desk calendar, right? You guys remember those huge desk calendars you put on your desk, right? One a month, right? So there are 5 of us in our family, and we all have initials RB, DB, JWB, WB, RWB. Don't ask me why, but that's why. Okay. And so everybody was color coded on this calendar, their sports, their birthday parties, their activities. And so they would eventually come to me and they would say, hey, um, can I go to so and so's house on Friday? And rather than me get up and go answer that question, I would say, I don't know. Go to the calendar and see what's on Friday and tell me if you can. It so that would give him or her one more time thing to do and come back. So we want them to be able to identify themselves and really see that time because calendars are an important visual support. They're critical if kids have working memory issues. And the earlier we can teach them the time task overlay, the more integrated it becomes to their natural everyday. By middle school, we really want them to be able to implement and maintain both tactile binders, organizational systems, as well as digital organization. More and more you'll see as they go off to college, there has to be a form of digital organization, but we always want to start in the concrete before we move to the abstract. And the same applies to organization with papers as well as time management. Okay. Um, we generally recommend digital planner not be introduced until high school, but really helping the kids build out their plan on paper. And then they're ready to move to that unless we're dealing with a significant case of dysgraphia. A lot of kids will say, well, I just want to use Schoology or I just want to use Canvas and all of my assignments are right there. Well, that's great, but your soccer practice isn't right there and your soccer game isn't right there, right? And the birthday party also isn't right there. So we've got to teach them how to integrate all of that information into one place. Helpful? Good. All right. So let's talk just briefly about the role of anxiety in executive function. So you may have heard of the prefrontal cortex, which is where executive functions occur. That's in the front part, just behind your eyebrows. And it is the decision making, thinking part of your brain that deals with language and thinking, all there in the prefrontal cortex. Now, when someone experiences anxiety or fear, the part of the brain that kicks in is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is that fight or flight or fawn response, right? It's what goes to protect us. It releases those, whatever the hormone is, that helps us feel strong and capable. But when the amygdala kicks in, it actually shuts off the prefrontal cortex. So when a student is experiencing anxiety, or the student is in fight or flight, their brain is actually turned off from being able to make good decisions. Okay. This is why if there's tension or you're arguing with a kid about homework, they're not actually able to make good decisions and follow through. Um, but there are a lot of things that will trigger or can trigger anxiety. It could be fear of failure, it could be removal of natural consequences or experiencing natural consequences. It could be peer pressure, learning differences, smartphones, right? I think that goes without saying, in social media, but also learned helplessness. Maybe we as a parent might have anxiety and the student's not actually able to label that they also have anxiety. All of these things will trigger the amygdala or can trigger the amygdala, which makes it hard to make good decisions. So, that component of remaining de escalated or finding a way to self soothe and be comfortable makes it a lot easier for the prefrontal cortex to engage so kids can have a conversation and find good ways to problem solve. Okay, I've got just a couple of slides left and then we'll open it up to Q&A. All right, so what are the impact of executive function skills and what can we expect from good instruction? So for organization, so I've separated this into two slides, a blue slide and an orange slide. So you'll see the two differences really. Having a system to categorize information, we need them to not only do their homework, we need them to turn it in and find it, take it back to school, right? Planning and prioritizing, how do they look ahead and they marry and make decisions about when do they do fun things versus when do they take care of their responsibilities? Know when there's going to be a test, studying a little bit every day, right? Planning and prioritizing. Working memory, learning how to keep a list, and task initiation. We had a young lady who was in our practice and had a lot of older sisters, struggled with working memory. The way it would manifest was actually at the dinner table. When everyone was talking, this young lady would blurt out information and she would interrupt everyone. And eventually her mom said, why do you interrupt people? And she said, because I'm afraid I'm going to forget what I have to say. Wow, what a powerful thing for this young lady to say. And I said, that's not a hard fix. Give everybody at the table a notepad, right? Everybody comes to the dinner table with a notepad. If someone has a habit of blurting, have everybody write their ideas down on paper so they won't forget them. And when they're ready to share, they have given themselves a little note and they know how to respond back. And so what happened was all her older sisters did it too. And so they modeled that for her so she didn't stand out. And she just saw that was a normal accommodation. So we want them to be able to start their homework, start their chores, not delay, right? Those are task initiation when I look at the bottom. Okay. Here's the impact of good instruction or emotional control. Responding to information in proportion to the information. Even better, talking calmly when they're stressed out or they're not getting information they don't like. Okay. Some kids have a big emotional response to that. If you haven't already read it, I recommend a very small book called Flooded. Okay. It's a fantastic read. It's very short. It's written by a woman who is actually a school counselor. And she gives a lot of strategies when your student is or your child is flooded. You've got all that big rush of emotion. How do we peel that back in a healthy way? How do we help them de escalate so they learn these strategies? It's a wonderful little book, but it's also something if you have a student who's struggling can be addressed in coaching as well. Flexible thinking, solving a problem, make changes comfortably. The opposite of this you might see is rigid, right? A student who's stuck. We want them to be able to accept a suggestion, process a suggestion, maybe try something new, and then aware of their impulsivity, being able to have a thought and hold it versus necessarily acting on it. Impulsivity and self monitoring is being in a safe place to look back on one's performance and evaluate whether or not your preparation worked, you executed well, or you might take a different approach next time. And that's what we think about when we talk specifically about some of the orange side skills that we'd like to see them have. Last, I would just leave this QR code and I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat the Charlotte location. Oop, that was the wrong one. Please disregard. And let's see here. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A. Thanks, guys, for taking a listen. Carrie, I think you're on mute.
Thank you.
I am. Yes. See, we were talking about how much we learned during COVID, and I still can't remember to unmute when I'm talking.
That's okay.
Thank you so much. I feel like every other sentence that came out of your mouth was a phrase that I wanted to write down and remember for
Thank you.
future
Thank
things.
you.
Even we were talking with my littles, my 5-year-old and my 1-year-old. I'm like, gosh, this even applies to the young kids. So thank you so much. Before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to, again, thank everybody for registering, for joining. Thank you for being here presenting, and just let everyone know that I'm going to stop the recording now.